we'll get into this cemetery walk, and I'm not going to deal too awful much with who came from where and so forth. I'll hit the dates and the people. This particular stone is Hannibal H. Kidd. When I was a boy, he was Ham Kidd. I read in here a lot of things that I guess I didn't know about him. And there's an awful lot I did know that's not in here. But he said he was the sixth son of William Nicholas and Nancy Lavina Kidd. He was born 3.5 miles northwest of Georgetown on a family homestead. His parents are buried there. His great-grandfather, William Kidd Sr., and why this man ever gave him names like that, I don't know, but he served in the American Army during the Revolutionary War. He enlisted in the summer of 1778, was severely wounded by a sword in the Battle of Camden in 1780, but he enlisted again in 1781. He was born in 1763, and he was 15 years old when he enlisted in the war. William Nicholas, which was Ham Kidd's family, was born in 1815 in Virginia, and he died in 1875. He married a lady, Nancy Parks, in Bloomington, Indiana, and I got to read this because I can't remember all of this. I'm skipping and hitting the highlights of it. But Ham attended the common schools. Now, I don't know what the uncommon schools were, but whatever it was, he went to the common school. And I presume that was public education is what they referred to at that particular time. And he'd moved with his parents from Tennessee to Vermilion County in the 1820s. Ham married Martha or Mattie Hartley here in Catlin. He bought the land that his grandfather William Kidd purchased with a land warrant that he got from given at his discharge from the war. He lived down, if you know where the Catlin Park is now, it used to be the grade school. Ham Kidd lived on a corner on the southwest corner right on Vermilion Street. And it was a house, had a big screen around it, and St. Elmo, I never knew his name was St. Elmo till I started this. Elmo Kidd lived the next house north or south of him. Ham ran, as I remember, a lock and key thing, a hardware store, but it was sort of a minimal hardware store in comparison to the one Frank Meneely had. Frank Meneely's hardware store was by far better stocked, and that particular time we were pretty well versed in what was in the stores because Jack Hawkins had a fetish for keys, and he had a ring of keys, had to be that big around, and he had a key to every business in Catlin. There wasn't a business that he didn't have a key to. So of an evening after they closed up, Hawkins had unlocked the door. Half a dozen of us would go in, Dukes Taylor and myself, Chuck, Joe, Paul. We'd go in these stores, then we'd lock the door, open the back door, let them in, lock that door, and we were inside the store. And there was only one policeman then, that was Elsie Lantern, and we knew how to avoid him. But
under arrest now.
We spent time in these stores, and we spent a lot of time in Hannibal Kidd's store, but he didn't have a lot of stuff like Frank Meneely had, so we generally went to Meneely's store. But Ham had all kind of padlocks and little things that he made keys out of. Elmo, I read in here, St. Elmo, and he didn't like to be called St. Elmo. I can understand why. But he lived, and I remember him well when he worked on these cars and various things. And Elmo went into the Navy at a later date and was at Great Lakes Naval Training Station. Forrest Kidd was born, and he died at an age that I don't know anything about, except that I do know who Forrest Kidd was and had heard of him. They had two other children. They had Eva Gladys, who was born in Catlin and died in 77, and Ephraim Stout Lillard, who was born in 1894 and died in 1965. They're both buried in National Arlington Cemetery. The other son I did know, who was Harlan Hamilton Kidd, and he was born in 1906 in Catlin and died in 1977. Ham Kidd was, as I remember him, a big, tall, thin man. He was an interesting fellow. but he really wasn't very personable when it came to kids. So at that particular time, I carried every kind of a newspaper and a magazine there was to carry in Catlin: the American, some you never heard of, Woman's Home Companion, the Ladies' Home Journal, the Saturday Evening Post, the Grit, Chicago Daily News, and so forth. At that time, I knew every single person in Catlin on a first name basis. There was no one in Catlin that I didn't know on a first name basis. And most of them knew me too, but some good and some bad. But we'll move over here. I wanted to just make note of one grave here, and we don't know very much about it, but it's how they decorated graves when little children died. And it's called Cliff. And the part of the grave, we just don't know a whole lot about it, but if you look at the top of the grave, it's got the little shoes and the socks hanging over the end of the grave, and it's a tombstone of an infant child. But I don't know the Russell. I don't know whether John or Theodore or any of them have any idea as to who it is or what.
There's another one.
And that's another little infant. And down here by where the angel is, right across from it, there's another one that has little children on it that I noticed that it's not a part of our cemetery walk, but it is interesting to see what kind of a tombstone they put up for small children. And I'm going to finish up with Hamilton's kid, and we'll walk over to, as soon as I see it, the Lloyd statue down here. The man standing on top of the tombstone.
What's the name of the Legion post?
Busby.
Isn't there a Legion post named Kid? Someplace.
Well, yeah, maybe. This stone here is, there are several stones in the area that are rather unique in so far as what they've done to them and so forth. The angel down here, I think, is a fascinating tombstone, but it's not one of the ones that we are covering today. As I said, there are some that if we were covering that were part of Vermilion County, and most especially Catlin. There's some others that I would know much better than I know some of these. My grandfather, whom I never knew, Morris over here, ran the livery barn in Catlin. That was down in what's now where Don Balzer's body shop is. And then there was another livery store in Catlin that I don't remember who owned it when I was very, very young. And it was down right behind where Herman Byerly used to live. And the foundation of that thing is still down. That's right behind where the Huffman Insurance Agency is now in that area. This one is the Lloyd family monument here. And it's a tribute to their son, who was William Russell Lloyd. And he was the son of Henry Lloyd and Sarah Church Lloyd. There are a lot of stories about it, and in talking to Shirley and some of the rest of the statue, how long it took to get here, what happened to this young man and so forth. And there's not a whole lot known about an accident he supposedly had and all. But this statue was made in Europe and sent over here, or so the story goes, to commemorate their young son who died at a relatively young age. And he was born in 79, so you say 80 to 1905, he's about 25 years of age, 26 when he died. The story is that it looked so much like him that it bothered the mother so much to see the statue that looked just exactly like him that they toyed with the idea of taking the statue down so it wouldn't be here anymore, because it upset her quite a bit. Henry Lloyd, who is the father of this gentleman here. Henry Lloyd was born in 1841 and he died in 1926. And he served in the Civil War as a private, Company G, with the Illinois Volunteer Infantry. And his residence was listed as Catlin. He enlisted in 1862 and he was mustered in 1862 and mustered out in 1865. His wife, Sophie Church, came from America, from London, came to America from London, and her father had come a year prior to that, which was natural then. Ordinarily, the head of the household came about a year ahead to the United States, and then he brought the family over a year later when he got located somewhere. I have always been mistaken, I guess. I thought that Ed Lloyd and Fred Lloyd were sons of this man, but doesn't say anything about this in the history. When I was a young boy, Ed Lloyd lived next to the last house outside of Catlin, where I believe Toby Jacobs' children or somebody live there now. And Fred Lloyd lived in the property that Eldon Vandy Walker lives in now. When I was young, those were beautiful places, especially Fred Lloyd's. It was a gorgeous place, had the bridge across the stream and all this type of thing, and it was just immaculate. And he was quite a stately individual, and they cut a pretty wide swath in Catlin because they were good landowners, they were good farmers, and they did make money. Now, we're going to Joel Acri, and I've got to figure out where I am. It's right over here, but where the statue with the top of the bulb is on it. And for the Acri family, and one family at least I can talk about in this, I do know them, and I knew them when I was a boy, and back to work for Uncle Whit Taylor for a while. But I wanted to thank Kathleen Harvey. She researched this portion of her family for this, and I'll try to stick to the script.
You don't have to do that, Ed. Whatever you want, you're doing great. You know, there's a lot of things I don't know. I get lost when I get in all the Thomas Taylor things, you know?
Is that right?
Well, there's so many people the same day. So many.
Okay, the people that we're going to talk about right in here, Acri, the Taylors, the Leighton McDonald, and the Joneses. Leighton McDonald is very interesting. Anybody owns any property in Catlin gets a tax bill, you'd probably see Leighton McDonald's first addition to Catlin, Leighton McDonald's second addition to Catlin. He owned the land that Catlin was built on. But we'll talk about the Acris first. He was born in 1813. He died in 1880. And he was the son of Ephraim Acri, who came to Vermilion County from Alabama. So we do have some rebel people that got up here and somewhat changed our lives a little bit. These things are extremely interesting to me. Ephraim bought 130 acres of raw land. Now that's just timber, nothing, never been cultivated. The first year he broke and farmed 6 acres of land. And the second year he broke 30 more acres of land. Corn at that time was 6 1/4 cents a bushel. And Joel Acri would take the corn about 10 to 15 miles to have it ground up so the family could use the corn in their everyday living. Ephraim died in 1835, and he was buried in the Butler Burying Ground. Well, that Butler Burying Ground is what is now called God's Acre. At that time, it was the Butler Burying Ground. The reason for this was the trail came through where God's Acre is now, came by here where Butler's Point is, went down along the high school here, down towards the Salt Fork River, and at the bottom of the hill before you get to what's now strip mine, Blue Lake Coal, that's where the salt was. And this was called the Little Salt Creek. It was right out here that ran down to it. At that time they found that there was salt down there. This enabled all the neighbors to do their slaughtering, to do their butchering and everything down at the old slaughterhouse. When I was a child, down at the slaughterhouse, it was still there, cabin area, had a big fireplace, and that's where they did all of their butchering, smoking and everything else down there. But that was the reason for the central part of this being what was going to be Vermilion County seat. This was the Indian Trail and the Settlers Trail down to the river there. Joe lived with his mother until he married. He purchased an interest in the family farm. He bought it from his brothers. and he had brought other land from time to time. He became a great landowner in the county, plus valuable land in Missouri. And Joel married Elvessa Yunt in 1848. They had 2 daughters, Mary, who was born 48, died in 27, and she married Tom Taylor, and there were 13 children. So I don't know what the winter was, or whether they didn't have any heat in the house or what it was, but 13 kids is an awful lot of kids. No TV. That'd be one thing. However, most of them got TV in the bedroom now. But she married Tom Taylor, and this is right back here is Tom Taylor, and Mary Akery, his wife. And the other daughter was Martha Jane, and she married Leighton McDonald, who is right over here. As I've told you a little bit about Leighton McDonald, and they were the parents of one daughter, and that was Oni Jones. Now we're getting into somebody that I know about when we start talking about Oni Jones, because I can talk about them. Leighton McDonald, right over here, he was born in Vermilion County in 1856, and he died in 1901. He had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. He married Martha Jane Akery. They had 1 daughter, Ona, who married Bill Jones. Leighton was a farmer until he became ill, and they had to move into Catlin. And they lived on the corner of the 4-way stop in Catlin. Now that had to be right across from where the old Gardener's restaurant was. How that ever ended up in our family, I don't know, but my mother did own it when I was a kid, because I'll never forget the time that Bob and I thought we found a fortune. They were tearing down that old frame house, and Farnham, all I ever knew him by was Skeet. Paul Taylor gave a nickname to everybody there was in Catlin. So Skeet, Farnham, and all his kids lived there in that corner house. And they were tearing it down, and we were down there, and in between the walls, we came up with the awfulest wad of money you ever saw. I think we had to spend of all the things we were going to buy until we found out it was Confederate money. And we took it down to Dad to show him what we had. And he said, kids, he said, that's worthless. And that we just tossed it away. Now I wish I had all of that bundle of Confederate money that we took out of the walls of that house. But it was worthless. It wouldn't buy anything. He helped organize the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, which I don't know where that is. This is Leighton McDonald now we're speaking of. He held the office of deacon. He was only 44 years of age when he died, but he had been a generous and public-spirited citizen. Now, Bill Jones, right over here. This gentleman I knew, he lived right across the street from us, and during Depression years, things were pretty lean, and Aunt Oni Jones and Bill had a cow, and they made butter and cream and everything else. But my job was every evening, I walked over with a 2.5-gallon pail, had a lid on top of it, 2 clamps. I never will forget it. I made that trip hundreds of times, and she sold us 2.5 gallons of skim milk after she skimmed the cream off of it for a nickel. And I'd take a nickel and go to Oni Jones's and get 2.5 gallons of skim milk. Well, she sort of felt sorry for us a little bit, and oftentimes she'd leave a little of the cream on, and then Mom would skim off the cream for Dad for his coffee and breakfast food or whatever we ate for breakfast. Bill was hard hearing. Bill Jones. He had a Model A. I don't know how many of you can go back to the Model A days. Just spark control on one side, throttle on the other. You pulled them down, and that was how you run, how fast you wanted to go. And Bill was hard hearing. He lived right across from us. We could hear Bill start his car up in the morning, and it'd just start revving up, revving up, revving up, because he'd just keep pulling it down till he could finally hear it run. And then when he knew it was running, he'd put it in gear and let out on the clutch, and the first 14 feet he covered in the air. And then he never shifted gears till he could hear it. And he'd run that thing, and he'd run it first gear, go down to Catlin every morning, Bill in that Model A, and I tell you, it roared. He couldn't hear. He started I'll run back here just a little bit and touch on. There was Arthur Church. Arthur Jones was born in London, England, and came to America. Henry came 6 months before Arthur, and they settled at Butler Point, which is right over here in this area. Arthur was growing up. He was a clerk in his brother Richard's store. They later became partners, and in 1895, Arthur was the owner of the store that was the A. Jones and Son grocery store. Arthur married Emma Dixon, born in England, came to America, and they were married in 1870, and there were 5 children. 2 died early, leaving Edward, William, and Dora, and married name of Cook. William was a clerk with Edward in his father's store. Then he started an insurance business. This is the Bill Jones that I know. He married Ona McDonald, and they had 5 children: Pauline, Winona, Carl, Earl, Jack, and Pauline. And Pauline is over here today. Jack I grew up with. Hell, I'll do one on you next year, or you do it on me. Maybe you do it on me. Jack Jones and Earl Jones I grew up with. As I said, they lived right across the street from us, so I knew them real well. Jack was 2 years older than I was, and Earl, I imagine, was maybe, I haven't looked to see when they were born and so forth, but he was probably 6, 8, 10 years older than I was.
What house did you live in, Jack?
Where'd I live? Do you know where my brother lives now, Bob?
Oh, you lived in Trellis.
That's
Yeah.
the one.
Okay.
That was the home place.
Okay.
And I was born in Danville, and I had double pneumonia when I was a baby and born, and they told my folks that we should move to a place where I could have fresh air and cow's milk.
Oh.
So my dad traded houses with Henry Jones, who lived there, and he took our house in Danville, and we moved to Catlin when I was 6 months of age. And I was born, raised there, lived there till I went to the military, lived there a little bit when I came back from the military, and then Ike and Ada Guyman lived right next door to us where my brother lives now, and he bought that property. Winona died here in 1983. She had married Gordon Russell, and they had no children. And Carl was just a baby and lived only 3 months and 6 days. Earl was born in 1910, and he died in 1953. He married Helen Pierce. She's still living, and she's out in Arizona, I believe.
No,
Florida. And I know that through Lloyd and Barbara, her brother, I hear from her from time to time. Bill had been very civic-minded. He'd been the mayor of Catlin, and so Terry Dolan can equate to that. On the building committee for the present high school, president of the school board, and the supervisor of this cemetery. It was rather unusual, but both he and his mother were born on Christmas Day. Tom Taylor here gets into the Taylor side of this thing, which is a prominent name in Catlin. If you come to Catlin, you want to be sure who you're talking to, because everybody's a relative in this town. And Tom Taylor, as you can see, the stone, you get behind the stone. See, I'll slide over behind one where it breaks the wind, and I'll try to cut this short so I don't freeze you to death out here. But Tom Taylor was he was born in 1847. He died in 24. He was the son of Thomas A. and Iva Allen Taylor, and you find out you had the Tom Taylor and the Tom Taylor and the Tom Taylor, and you don't know which one you're talking about because there'd be a half a dozen of them all named. How they kept the mail straight, I guess maybe they didn't get any mail in that particular time. They were natives of Kentucky, so we got a little more southern blood up in here. He was a great landowner, and he owned over 820 acres. That is a lot of farm ground back in that day. That's a lot of money. He was a very intelligent businessman. He was a director of the First National Bank of Catlin, also on the board of the Oakwood Bank, and he married Mary Acree, and that ties into the Acrees. They had 13 children. Mary was born in 48, died in 1927. Their children were Clemmer, Andrew, Gail, his wife Marietta, Joe, Elvessa, Robert, Myrtle, and they had children of Dorothy and Wilford and Norman. Norman Taylor, I'm sure you saw him down there today. He was at the museum. And Margaret married Willis Worry. And I could start telling you stories about Willis Worry and my growing up with Willis Worry, and it could go on for an hour. But then he had sons Thomas and Buell, and that Buell Taylor and Tom Taylor, and Tom is still living, and Buell just passed away here 5-7 years ago, I guess. And Catherine, my Aunt Catherine, and I know I'm related to the Douglases, and they were always Aunt Catherine and Uncle Herman and John and so forth. And I don't honestly know how this relationship took place. It's somewhere through Mom's side of the family, but I was always just tickled to death to be related to them, because at that particular point in time, during the Depression and so forth, there wasn't any clothes. And my folks sure couldn't buy any clothes. So I always got John Allen Douglas's hand-me-downs, and then Mom cut them where they'd fit me, and as soon as I outgrew them, she'd patch the knees and give them to Bob. So he got them the third time down. And there was John Jr. and grandson John Jr. And John Jr. now, of course, is the John T. Douglas that runs the bank down here. Also Harriet, and it says here, and I don't know whether it's a mistake or whether it says Harriet Howard, and 2 died young. Well, that's not correct, because Harriet Howard was married to Coon Howard, and Coon Howard lived, if you know where Steve Miller lives now, that was the old Taylor property, and right next door to it, the next one beyond, where Jack and Ann Royster lived when they got married, that was where Coon and Harriet Howard lived, and they had 2 children. They were both girls, and it was Harriet, Julia June, and Rachel. And I went to school with them, and fact of the matter, I'm almost certain that at least Rachel is still living. And
Jack, what I wanted to say was, I listed the people. See, Tom and Mary had 13 kids.
yeah.
If you were to count the names of
And
the
they
persons,
2 died. All right.
their children
Well,
died
my
young.
apologies
Yeah,
to you
but
and
that's
to
what
Rachel
I
and
meant.
Harry,
I
or
just-
Rachel and Julia June. They're
Yeah,
still living.
No, I wasn't questioning that.
The way I read it here, it says
Yeah.
Harriet and 2 died young, and I
Well,
thought, well,
see,
she did have 2 children, but they didn't die
No.
because I went to school with her.
That's okay.
And this lady has a special place in my heart, and this is Annie Vest.
Yeah.
Annie Vest lived where Steve Miller lives now. Annie Vest Taylor, she took Byard, she was never married, and she was an old maid. She was the nicest person you ever met. And at a particular point on a Christmas morning, somewhere in 1932 or 33, in the height of the Depression, and I was out, did something, and she said, "Where are you eating Christmas dinner?" And I said, "We're at home." And she said, "Well, what are you having for Christmas?" And I said, "We're having eggs." But that's all we had, was eggs. And she said, "Oh," and it just broke her heart. So she came over and she got Mom and Dad and Bob and I, brought us over to her house, and she had cooked chicken. And we had chicken and dumplings and noodles. And I tell you, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I hadn't eaten a meal like that for ages.
Did you ever get your eggs?
No, I wasn't interested in eggs after that. But Annie Vest Taylor, she was a dream. She was a person that, there wasn't a young kid in the country that didn't like Annie Vest Taylor. She was something else. And that just about takes us up through the things that I had there. As I say, there's many places in here. I saw Ab Snell's grave when I was walking around, and I thought of the times when I was a little kid, and Ab would gather around a whole bunch of us, and he probably lied a little bit, because I think all of us do, but he'd tell us where the Indians were. And before there was a grade school there, that was the Indian encampment, right where the old Catlin grade school was. And he'd talk about the Indians at night, and they'd be over, sit with them and talk to them and everything else, how they trailed and where they came through. But there's some interesting people. Frank Gardner over here. I always go back over and see where he was a the most popular man in town when we were kids, because he had the restaurant and he had a dance hall on the other side of it. And he was just super. We liked him. There was Crib, Turpning, and the rest of them. And they're buried around here different places. But as I walk through, I see Ike and Ada Guyman. They were my next door neighbors. They live where my brother lived now. And a story about Ike, he's a pretty rich man. But he never owned anything in his life but bib overalls. And that was it. He went to church in bib overalls. He went anywhere he went in bib overalls. And an old pair of muddy shoes. And it didn't bother him where it was or who it was. He wanted to buy a car. He came to my dad and he said, asked Lee, he said, would he go with him over to Indianapolis? Because there was no car dealers around here and he wanted to buy a good car. And Dad went with him over to Indianapolis, and they went into I believe it was a Hupmobile dealership. Had a big car. Cost, at that time, as I remember my dad telling the story, cost about $17,000, $18,000 for that car. It was big. But Ike went into the dealership and dressed in those overalls and those dirty shoes and everything else. Nobody ever even come out to ask him what he wanted. And Dad said they stood around a while and he said, let's leave. And so they went over to a dealership somewhere in Indianapolis that handled a Rio. And they went in and looked at it. And fortunately for that young man, somebody came out and asked him what he wanted. And he said, I don't know, I want that car. And he said, well, it's X number of dollars, whatever it was, and that's okay. And he said, I'll just give you a check for it. And he couldn't drive. He said, we'll come back and get it next week. And the fellow said, cleared the check. He said, well, I'd have to call on the check and all. And so he called the Catlin Bank to check on Ike Guyman's check, see if it was any good for this car. And Herman Douglas was the president of the bank. And he said, well, I'll put it that way. If he wants to buy your dealership, sell it to him and take a check. So I'd give you an idea how much money he had. But they adopted Darrell, who was an orphan boy, and raised Darrell Guyman. He took their name. He lived up on top of the hill where Peter Shacks live now. But there are just name after name after name. Then in a period of 70 years that I can walk around here and see these people, I can shut my eyes and remember the stories they told and the things that I enjoyed as a boy. But I won't bore you anymore. I appreciate you coming. It's sort of chilly out here. But if you have a chance sometime, I'm sure that you'll know an awful lot of these people. And I'm not quite ready to go yet, but sometime I'll be here at some point in time. Some other guy say, well, I know a story about him. And he probably does.
We thank you, Jack.
Well,
Thanks, Jack.
we appreciate